Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the Osint Bunker podcast. This week it's season 5, episode 6. I'm joined by my co-hosts Austin and Technical, and we're rejoined this week by our guest All Source News, who was with us during the last episode. This week we've got a fair amount to talk about, so we will crack straight on, I think, with Ukraine.
Yeah, I know I'm gonna steal this from all sources as soon as possible. So sorry about the Central America focus for you, but that's getting yeeted out the window today. So speaking about feints, the Ukrainian counteroffensive. I think the last few weeks have probably been the busiest. I think we've seen in the information space. Not a lot has actually happened practically in like the real world. Whereas between Russian mill bloggers, Ukrainian mill bloggers, and the Twitter sphere as a whole, I think how many counteroffensives have been started on Twitter in the past like 3 weeks? We're up to like 5 or 6 maybe. Between positioning and clearing activities around Bakhmut with the Azov Battalion and 3rd Assault Brigade, and various groups kind of cleaning up, the approaches into Bakhmut to sort of stabilize the front there, and the incursion into Belgorod, which was definitely done by Russian partisans with no Ukrainian interference whatsoever. They got those Humvees and MRAPs from Russian stocks. they definitely got them from inside of Russia. And of course other sort of frontal areas, and I couldn't, I would be extremely remiss if I didn't mention Ukrainian sort of online information preparation operations, where they're kind of teeing up an offensive. I mean, Zelensky and other sort of large profiles, whether that be on Twitter or actually in real life, have sort of been pushing the narrative, we're going to retake it any day. The counteroffensive could start at any minute. And that is causing a lot of discontent and, how do I put it, panic among certain people in the information space, especially Russians. Russian mill blogger accounts, frankly, have probably started 15 or 20 fake counteroffensives in the past few weeks as well. Any slight Ukrainian advance in any area kind of has been taken a bit out of context, and there's a bit of panic. And I think that leads me into sort of an open question for the group. But how chaotic do you think the Russian information space is going to be between the mill bloggers, Wagner, and everyone else? How chaotic is that environment going to be once the actual Ukrainian counteroffensive starts?
Well, I think that's an interesting point, Google, because I mean, if you look at Russian Telegram right now and across in all the sources, I mean, it's to your point. I mean, it is a mass confusion and panic. Like, they don't have a clear understanding of what's kind of going on the ground. And let's tie it to Belgorod, right? Like, that offensive caught a lot of people off guard, right? There's these raids that occurred. And it's pretty shocking because even the Russians clearly don't even have an own understanding of their military position. So I think when a counteroffensive occurs, right, and we don't know exactly what's going to happen, and I think this constant beating of the drums by the Ukrainians saying, "Oh, it's going to happen anytime," or "It happened here or there," I think it just feeds into that information warfare of just causing mass confusion. We have seen the Russians just not have good situational awareness what happens in the war, but this isn't new. I mean, I think we can all look at Kyiv, we can look at Kharkiv, we can look at Kherson, and a constant theme is from a command and control piece, and the Russian military is very atrocious. It's not at the level where we all thought it would be for a modern 21st century military that has invested so heavily, especially on these, this technological advancement. So their command and control is atrocious, and then just the situation and their ability to push messaging and understanding across the Russian information sphere is terrible. And it's almost ironic that when you track Russian media, Telegram, they are much more pessimistic and much more confused than, let's say, Western supporters of Russia, right? It's almost like the Western supporters of Russia, those in the West, like your Scott Ritters, your Kim.com, etc., are very, like, they've toed the line of Russian state media, right? But then when you go to the Russian side, it's just mass confusion to the point where even on Telegram, we see Russian military guys go on Telegram and send information there because they have no way else of conveying any sorts of information throughout the force. And it's going to be a very bad thing for Russia when the counteroffensive happens, because it's just going to get worse and worse and worse for them. And I think that's a huge detriment to them.
Yeah, and I think it's funny to see how kind of almost little control the sort of central Russian state apparatus has over a lot of these mill bloggers, where you'll just kind of see them either wandering around eastern Ukraine, getting involved, basically, going to units and reporting and causing massive, OPSEC issues, which very funny. I think we saw an incident last week where a Ukrainian HIMARS strike hit a Russian installation. Russian mill bloggers posted pictures very soon after the strike and tweeted about it or posted on Telegram about it. And 20, 30 minutes later, the Ukrainians hit it again because they weren't happy enough with the first strike, because they got immediate BDA on the actual results of the strike. And so I don't even think that's like a propaganda thing. That's more of a sign of the Russian government just not having control over their mill bloggers or their online environment.
Yeah, and let's look at 2016, right? The U.S. presidential election. How everybody was like, look at Russian propaganda, right? Brexit is another perfect example, right? Like this ability that we had, this idea that we had of Russia's just almost absolute dominance in their information warfare, right? I mean, their whole aspect of hybrid warfare that Gerasimov, the doctrine that he famously wrote, really touched upon this issue of specifically the information warfare, which is gaining traction in the 21st century, military. And you look at the U.S. military, how they're changing their doctrine. It's always about information. That's the huge push now. And so we had this idea of Russia pre the invasion of Ukraine in 2022 to now. And it's just completely opposite. I mean, they have completely lost, for most part, the information space. And I think the military bloggers is an excellent point, but at the same time, a lot of times the most accurate depictions we get of Russia's military comes from military bloggers. I believe this was a couple of weeks ago. Before Bakhmut fell, we I think we all read that long post from a military blogger. When the 3rd Brigade in Alos launched that offensive, I think in south of Bakhmut, right, where there was kind of this change between Wagner and I believe it was a Russian military unit. I can't remember on the top of my head which one it was. And they laid out, though, that military blogger laid out the issue that basically there is no trust within any of the units. There is no communications within these units. Russia, Wagner, the DPR, the LPR. They all have basically separate chains of information, separate channels to convey vital information. And then the lack of ability to crosstalk between those organizations just degrades more command and control, which also ties into this idea of defensive operations during a Ukrainian counteroffensive. If you have zero ability to effectively communicate across the formations in a decisive battle, I mean, command and control is probably safe to assume can completely break down. And we've seen what happens in Russia when command and control just breaks down. It just does not end well. But our only source of probably legitimate information we're going to get on the Russians, ironically, is going to be these mill bloggers who somehow the Russian state has had zero ability to seriously clamp down on.
Yeah, and the ramifications of that, as you said, I think we're still learning. To be honest, at the end of the day, we're really trying to figure out what is happening in the information space and how badly the Russians are actually kind of screwing it up, for lack of a better term. But I think the main thing that kind of happens in the information space there is how quick to panic they are. It's not just a leak of information, it's not just a lack of control over the information space, but it is sort of this hive mind in a way. It's really interesting to see because, when it comes to at least offensive disinformation ops, the Russians are kind of chronically online in a way. At least the Russian state, intelligence apparatus. And I think you could say during Ukraine, the sort of the general Russian defense apparatus is also chronically online, in that they display the worst traits of being like chronically on Twitter, which is disinformation, misinformation, generic panic, and a variety of other sort of hive mind. It's the Twitter hive mind. It's this horrifying thing. And I think that is kind of a characteristic of how Russia has been, at least for the past 10 or 15 years now. At least in the online space, in that they'll make these online cyber offensives. But also there's the huge downside of that, in that it can kind of come around and, oh no, now all the morons are online and they've have huge followings and they're causing panic.
Well, and I would also say the problem with consistent coordinated cyber offensives is you start to set expectations amongst those who are perhaps on your side but aren't being either directly supported or funded by you. So that's a major reason why I think we're seeing a major difference between sort of organic Russian Telegram, like mill bloggers and all that, and some of the folks in the West who generally will toe the line of the Russian state. When you're just towing the line of the state, all you need to do is wait for the latest thing that they say, put it back out there, maybe put your own spin on it, bing, bang, boom, you're good. But if you're someone who's sort of been organically driven to support this, and you're coming up with your own ideas and you have all of these expectations in your head, like a great example is sort of, on the Russian information space, it's been all about Bakhmut for the last, 5, 6, 7 months. And after, the information on Bakhmut starts to die down, you start to have some sort of a conclusion there. It becomes what next? And when that what next is a raid into Belgorod, that throws a lot of these expectations out the window, and you're left with a bunch of people who organically were supporting you, but are now saying, what the hell's going on?
And I think technical, you hit the key word. It's panic. I mean, that is a consistent thing we see. I mean, look at when Luhansk was getting hit, right? Those deep strikes that came out to be, the shadow strikes, etc. And then before that, even before Bakhmut fell, the counteroffensive where Wagner's chief Prigozhin, and it's almost like Prigozhin is a lead in this panic, right? Because I think he tries to depict things realistically. I mean, there's probably also he has his own interest of highlighting deficiencies in the lack, quote unquote, of support from the Russian Ministry of Defense to kind of show like that Wagner is fighting against all odds and still being victorious. But I think once you get a clear understanding of what the ground is, and that the fact that they're in the Russian information space, there are people who try to convey some legitimate information and criticism in the Russian military, is quick to panic. But can you really blame them? Because how is it that Russia, right, has not been able to had a decisive win in Ukrainian? I mean, what can we really look at since February of 2022 and say, without a doubt, no questions asked, here's a decisive Russian win that has altered the situation on the ground? And I think that's what's crazy, and I think that's what's insane. And then a lot of the people in the Russian military bloggers who were sold in this idea of just absolute Russian military power, of being the second strongest military in the world, when they see the second strongest military in the world fight so horrendously and so terribly in Ukraine, I think that image of invincibility shattered. And so these people, I think, who are extremely nationalistic, right, who want nothing more than an absolute win against Ukraine, are left baffled by the fact that they haven't achieved a win. And so the easiest way for them to have an excuse to explain that is the Russian Ministry of Defense leadership. And I think Shoigu and Gerasimov are the two key figures that they're trying to pin the blame on everything. It is way more widespread than that. But that try to pinning blame then just leads to more and more panic. And I think that panic, technical, is just going to grow and grow and grow.
Yeah, and I do think that comes a lot from, as you mentioned, kind of this invulnerability that was painted before the war of the Russian military. I mean, how long have Russian bloggers, or even, stuff like, quote unquote, reputable outlets like Forbes have been talking about, the T-14 Armada, entering service next year and it'll totally defeat the Abrams, or the Su-57, the greatest fighter in, the world, is gonna, it's in service now and it can defeat anything. And I think the Russians have been really good at kind of painting this picture of invulnerability. For the past, 10, 15 years, maybe, ever since the very early Ratnik reforms. These missions to modernize the Russian military, turn it into this, first world fighting force that's highly professional and volunteer based, and kind of casting away the conflicts in Chechnya as this bad period that it never happened, sweeping under the rug, this old technology and stuff. And they really pushed hard for that but a lot of it went into appearance. A lot of it was just, embezzled. And another pretty big chunk of it went towards maintaining the nuclear deterrence. And at the end of the day, the Russians really had it was the old Russian military. It's basically the 1990s Russian military that had a new coat of paint slapped on it. Minor changes made in certain areas, and then they tried to sort of enact their new doctrine, or at least their slight doctrinal change. Going to BTGs, going to let's make the thunder run towards Kiev and take it like the Americans did Baghdad. When they didn't have a lot of the underlying changes that actually needed to be made to do that. I mean, you can go back and look into history. I mean, Russia has had an infatuation with being European for hundreds and hundreds of years, and this kind of connects back to it. They didn't really utilize their underlying structural advantages that had sort of been generated during the Soviet Union, and they kind of wanted to emulate this different successful positioning, and it just didn't work. Because again, it's the Russian military. It's not the U.S. military. It's not NATO. And that's kind of probably what's contributed some to their underlying lack of success. Also, massive intelligence failures and your standard palace disconnect from the real situation. But I do really think this is this long-term kind of both internally motivated information gap, and one that was aimed at an external audience as well. And that's kind of just come to a head during the war. And there is nothing like a conflict to really, really get through and cut through the bullshit that you've been putting out. It will really, that is the true measure of what you're actually able to do. There weren't Su-57s patrolling over Ukraine, doing combat air patrol. No, they were held back because the Su-57 actually isn't stealthy and is there's a potential risk to it from older S-300s that the Ukrainians had. And now you have Ukrainian Patriots that can actually reach out and hit Su-35s and Su-34s and low flying helicopters over Russian territory. And I really do think that is a huge element of what's actually happening.
And you bring up a good point about the Russian military, and there's this book, and I've said this multiple times, and I'll just say it here in the podcast. There's this amazing book by Kenneth Pollock called Armies of Sands, and the book's premise ties of like deficiencies of the Arab militaries, right? Like, why is it that Arab militaries just cannot perform effectively as a modern military force? And this was published obviously before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but it's very similar to kind of like the deficiencies that that he identified with Arab militaries. You can draw a direct correlation with the Russian military, right? And one of the arguments that Pollock was saying is that you cannot measure corruption as one of the main, not even just one of the sole factor, but a main factor of deficiencies in modern militaries, right? Because he lays out examples of why that's not the case. And I think a very in-depth analysis needs to be done at the Russian military, right, to understand failures, because I think it's much more engraved than just corruption. I mean, there's a fundamental, and what Kenneth Pollock mentioned in the Arab military is their deficiency was kind of because of cultural reasons, right? That there was this huge problem in Arab culture that makes it difficult for them to fight kind of this 21st century warfare, right? And I'm just quickly summarizing his conclusions. But you can almost look at that and look at the Russian military and see everything where they failed fighting against Ukraine and almost tie in a direct correlation to that, right? And I think a lot of people after this are going to do in-depth studies. There's going to be amazing research on this. And there's going to be a serious realization that what happened in the Russian military in the invasion of Ukraine is much more severe than just corruption. I mean, this is an absolute failure of what everybody anticipated the 21st century Russian military was going to be. And it's almost ironic that a lot of the mistakes they did in Chechnya, and then more importantly in 2008 in their invasion against Georgia, they not only did they experience it in Ukraine, but at magnitudes of worse levels because of the scale in the invasion, right? And I think a lot of us are going to have to like really look into this. And then, I think there's an important aspect of how not only Western militaries fight, but I think specifically, the U.S., where we all view the U.S. as the preeminent military power in the world, that there's something very unique about Western military doctrine that enables utilization of successful combat operations in the 21st century. That and it's not just technology. You can't just look at technology, because I can easily make the argument that I can get, in the United States, the National Training Center, NTC. And I think that lack of emphasis on the person in the Russian military and in the command structure and in the soldiers and that individual to collective training is probably a key facet in which the Russians hope to make up for that deficiency with, as you said, technical, the T-14s, the Sukhoi 57s. I think Austin, and by all means carry on this conversation, because it's like what you said is like the Germans and the wonder weapon, right? Like there's one weapon that's going to turn the tide of the war, and it's going to be the victory. And that's what the Russians consistently sell. Then you see it now with their nuclear weapons and their hypersonic missiles and all this. It's like, this is our wonder weapon, and this is going to be the key to victory. But we've seen is that weapons don't win wars. It's still people. It's still in human nature. It's still a human fight.
See, I don't think it's just that, because I know Fukuyama follows me, which means there's a non-zero chance that he's listened to podcasts at some point. So if he does, I'd probably make him die inside a bit. But it's this concept of the fact that non-democracies have inherent issues. And going back to the Middle Eastern armies is a lot of the deficiencies that they suffer is the fact that it is not a meritocracy by any means. There are inherent deep issues that they can't overcome because of their non-democratically placed systems. There are problems with how they do things that just absolutely destroy their capabilities and ability to actually hold leaders responsible and properly prepare for events that may possibly be negative, and properly allocate resources as well. And we see this a lot, again, across the Middle East, in Russia, and other places, with this sort of this non-democratic approach to actual, not just resource allocation, but people allocation. And again, that's a huge problem with Russia. That's a deep ingrained problem that they deal with, and that they've dealt with for a while now.
I would tack onto that, and I would say not only do we see this issue in autocracies, we see this issue in democracies that lack legitimacy or feel like they need to bolster their sense of legitimacy. And I think a really good example of that is looking at the Iraqi army post occupation. And the lead up to sort of the conflict with ISIS, where you had many sort of major commanders being placed there for political reasons. And as a result of that, some of the initial skirmishes between ISIS and the Iraqi army went quite poorly for the Iraqis there. I just think in general, when a state is reliant upon the military to continue its legitimacy, and it's either a young state or a state that's recently gone through regime change, or it's autocratic, then you do have this sort of natural trend towards placing people in positions not based upon merit, but based upon what they can support, do to support either the leader in the case of an autocracy or the state itself in the case of a democracy that lacks legitimacy. But I think more towards All Sources' point in regards to how did the Russian military get here, I think on top of corruption, on top of complacency, from a tactical or strategic level, the Russian state hasn't really needed to fully commit its military to a conflict since, I would say, maybe you could make the argument for Chechnya, maybe you could make the argument for Afghanistan back during the Soviet days. So some of these larger issues there were hints towards them in Georgia, there were hints towards them in Transnistria, but what's clear is that the Russian strategy was never expecting to go up against as determined or as large of a foe as what we've seen the Ukrainian military become.
And it's funny you say that, because I think if you look at the U.S. a historical example that I think people forget is that in the Vietnam War, people forget how it transformed completely how the U.S. military operates and fight. Because of the Vietnam War, specifically if you look at the Army, there was changes in U.S. military doctrine in general, just both at the joint level and the Army level. So you had the air-land concept, right, of the integration of air and land warfare. You had the establishment of the U.S. Training Command. And a lot of these focus and then on modernization, et cetera, is what then, because of the failure of Vietnam, The 80s, then we saw this, modernization, rearmament, etc., and then more importantly, the focus on training. So that in the 1991 Persian Gulf War, the U.S. was in an infinitely better place to fight, right? And a lot of the people I know were veterans of the first Gulf War, and it's funny because they tell us, hey, when we were in the Army, and we were sent as part of Operation Desert Shield in the 90s, and we were going to invade Iraq, the casualty estimates, they said, was going to be 10, 20,000 U.S. soldiers killed. And they said that was acceptable back then. Like, that was an acceptable casualty rate for the U.S. military. And because you look at it, like, Saddam Hussein had one of the largest militaries in the world, had a very sophisticated, robust air defense system. They had an air force, they had an army. And although after the 8-year when the Iran-Iraq war, they just fought a war compared to the United States that fought a completely different war in Vietnam. Right. But the lessons learned of Vietnam enabled the United States to have an absolute dominance in Iraq that it wasn't even remotely close. And I think, to your point, I think that the ability to adjust to lessons learned enable militaries to be more successful in future warfare. And we've seen the Russian military not do that since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Again, the mistakes in Chechnya and the Georgian War are still plain. And then still, by the way, now a lot of the mistakes that, although the Russian military, I think, have acknowledged, and the general staff has acknowledged that they're not able to do these deep strike operations that's kind of in the Soviet doctrine, and they didn't have the manpower to effectively did that because they thought that Ukraine was going to collapse. So they did make some adjustments to their strategy overall, but the huge deficiencies across multiple areas of the Russian military are still plain to see to this day. And I think it goes to your point, in this autocracies, they just do not accept lessons learned that changes how they fight or how they train to then be successful in future operations.
Something history is over. Yeah, but I again, I really do think it is one of those complex issues that's, and again, it's why the Russians probably haven't solved it, because again, it's a complex issue that you can't, you're an autocracy. There will be corruption that comes with that autocracy. How do you get out of that? Well, you stop being an autocracy, but then we have to stop being an autocracy. And I think those long-term reforms, when before Ukraine, they could just paint over it with, again, programs like Ratnik and, putting the Su-57, quote unquote, into service. But now that they're in Ukraine, they actually have to face a country that is really fighting, made, a number of reforms post 2014. And I think sort of now we're seeing the ramifications of that. The ramifications at the moment have mainly been conscription, which is one of the not great routes to go down, for an autocracy, because you're starting to mess with the people and the willingness of the people to deal with you. But I think that the longer this goes on, they're going to have to make significant decisions about how they're actually running the war.
Yeah, I'd entirely agree. And I'd also just, on the history ends part, when we look at chances for the Russian military or the Soviet military to make reforms, just the simple history in the fall of the Soviet Union really was not conducive for making the sorts of changes and reforms that we saw out of the U.S. after Vietnam and then again after Grenada. I think just naturally having a stable democracy is far more conducive for long-term military reform than going from a communist state to I don't know what you would call Russia today, an oligarchic capitalistic autocracy. But I mean, yeah, there never really was much of an opportunity post Afghanistan for reform within the Soviet military. And then again, with the rampant corruption running through the new Russian Federation in Chechnya, there wasn't much appetite, drive, nor effort given towards reforms post Grozny. And so again, we're seeing the long-term ramifications of that.
Yeah, and I mean, no one ever wins in Afghanistan, let's be honest. It's kind of the historical context, or the historical constant. Though I think some countries learn from whatever they fail within Afghanistan. Though who knows if those lessons will ever be taken to heart. But I do think, in the long run, Russia has just been unable to properly put together reforms. and they saw that the day they invaded Ukraine. You know, from literally hour number one, things went south for them. Like it legitimately, the second they actually had to touch Ukrainian contact, just things went south. And that is kind of that constant.
To which I would say, I think that a nice sort of follow-up question here for discussion is, today we're looking at a very different Russian military than what we were looking at, even a year ago. We're looking at a Russian military that has relatively more manpower in the field, but at a far less experience level. And now we're potentially looking at a Russian military that may be conducting almost entirely defensive operations. So there's quite a few sort of known unknowns with how strong / or weak is Russian military morale and some of these mobilized units who, if they're on maybe the Kharkiv front, they haven't seen a ton of action in the last 6 months. If they're on other fronts, they've probably been doing a lot of digging. How does that sort of match up to the large amount of information that we have seen from the Ukrainians, at the very least, on some of these units coming back from NATO countries? They're coming back from training. They're coming back with new equipment. They seem to be in relatively to extremely high spirits. At what level do we see either the panic that we've seen from the Russian info space really start to take hold within Russian military formations, or do they, tend to hold their lines?
So it's first, Austin, I think can we just highlight how crazy a statement that is actually, I think, for the most part, too, that you just made, that the Russian military is probably not capable of launching offensive operations. I mean, I think that's a huge thing. Like, that's insane to suggest that after just over a year of warfare that the Russians have done, their military capability to launch further offensive operations into Ukraine has basically been destroyed. Right. And so I think that this idea that they have any offensive capability in the European theater, like if you're a EUCOM commander and official, and I know one of the EUCOM commanders, mentioned like, oh, Russia's still a threat. And obviously he's going to say that. But like, I think if you're Poland right now, you're like, OK, we're good. Like we're set. This is probably the weakest the Russian military has been in since the fall of the Soviet Union. We're pretty much secure at this aspect. Right. But I think, Austin, let's compare both sides in Russia and Ukraine. Right. So both countries did mass mobilizations, Russia later, right? So both militaries are, for the most part, now conscription-based. And they both had issues. I mean, we've seen reports of Ukrainians quickly mobilized and sent to Bakhmut with minimal training and the issues that had in Bakhmut. But the irony is that even in those situations, we haven't seen, although there was incidents of units pulling out of Bakhmut when they probably shouldn't have to, or without, there was disorganization, it didn't lead to a broad collapse, let alone in the Donbass, but more importantly in Bakhmut, right? And I think that's a testament to Ukrainians' morale and ability to continue to fight. And although there's a lot of issues and a lot of the people we talk to, they highlight those. But I think it does show a measure of reassurance of the Ukrainians' ability to maintain broad sector throughout a large sector of their defensive force and ability to defend against Russian offensive operations. And again, you also see tens of thousands of Ukrainians have being trained in the West, in Europe, in the United States, et cetera, right? And I think that's a model that we've seen, that the Ukrainians had a large segment of their military in Europe being trained during the Russian winter offensive. You compare that to the Russian side, right? When they did their mass mobilization, there was minimal training. I mean, one of the things across the board is that, for most part, most mobilized persons did not receive significant amount of training, and they were quickly sent to the front. And a lot of these people that were sent to the front, let's say they were slated to be a radio operator, were just given a rifle and said, "You're now an infantryman. You're going on offensive operations," right? And I think
more start digging ditches.
Yeah, or whatever it may be, right? And so they weren't trained, and they weren't even utilized how they were supposed to be fighting, right? And so that goes into the kind of the issue when we're analyzing militaries. You can analyze it with tangible effects, like, okay, amount of equipment, what equipment they had, the amount of personnel, maybe even the training that they received. But then there's also these intangibles that are very hard to measure, but can almost be decisive in any military operations. And one of them obviously is morale, but even mission command and how they treat soldiers and how they're utilized in a fight. And I think that's the huge problem of the Russian military that they're running into right now, is that they just simply are not an effective fighting force. And more importantly, it's almost as if the Russians that are fighting in Ukraine, either being from the Russian MOD, the DPR, LPR, and Wagner, and other private military corporations that are fighting there. There's not this unified of command. There's not this one. Everybody would say, Gerasimov is, as the senior commander, he should be the one calling the shots, and all the information freely goes there, and then he's able to understand the battlefield clearly, effectively, and then make decisions as such. We all know that is not happening, right? And so the ability of not only the soldier but the staff at both the Ukrainian and the Russian military, I think there's a huge dichotomy and a huge difference between both, right? And it does provide this sense that the Ukrainian military has the upper hand. It's hard to, I've said this in the last podcast with you, Osint, and John, that we are very much have to, I'm cautiously optimistic of Ukrainians. We just haven't seen Ukraine launch an offensive what it looks like of this magnitude. And to be fair, we haven't seen these types of offensive operations since the initial push of the Russians into Ukraine, which we all know the Russians had issues. So now the question is, how are the Ukrainians are going to do it? How are they going to fight? And although what we've seen so far historically has given us reasons to be optimistic, we just don't know how the Russians, in a situation like this, where they're facing a massive force, do they have the morale to fight on, right? Are we going to see an example of the Ukrainians fight in the beginning of the war where they just fought no matter what? Or is the Russian military going to end up like the Afghan, government's military forces during the push from the Taliban in 2021, where they just collapsed quickly? And I think you can look and say that it can go either way. But a lot of these, as I said earlier, untangible measurements that is hard to really quantify, I think that's going to be a key factor that determines how the Russian military is going to fight. And we probably won't actually see it until the offensive happens and we start getting reports, specifically from Russian military bloggers stating, hey, this is what's going on.
Yeah, and I think you bring up an interesting question: is more longer term, results if the Russian lines do collapse during a potential Ukrainian counteroffensive. Yeah, I can only guess at what the long term implications that would actually be. I mean, there are a lot of potentials there.
I suppose one question our viewers will have now is, how far off are we from the proper Ukrainian offensive? We've obviously seen today that the Chief of Staff of the Ukrainian military has released that video, which I think is intended as a recruitment video, but for those of you who haven't watched it, I have retweeted it. It's a hell of a watch, really. Very, very well sort of filmed and very, very good for propaganda purposes. But how far off do we think, guys? How far off do we think we are now, really, from the offensive launching, bearing in mind how much Western equipment has now been supplied to Ukraine, and the ongoing discussion that Ukraine's been saying for a little while now that they are getting ready to make that counter-offensive?
So I think it was like a senior advisor. I can't remember specifically who it was, but from like the Ukrainian president or their kind of equivalent to their Ministry of Defense, said it could be today, tomorrow, or next week. Right? They're not putting a specific date, but I guess there's this whole sentiment that's imminent. But I think, Defense to your point, I think it's going to be determined on the ground. Right. So when you generally at the tactical level analyze military operations in the U.S. military, we use what's called METTC. It's an acronym, and it stands for Mission, Enemy, Terrain, Time, Troops Available, and Civil Considerations. And now with with multi-domain operations, this new Army doctrine, now they've added information to that acronym. And I think what you look at when you look at all that, right? Let's say, okay, well, we kind of understand what the mission is from the Ukrainians, right? So the mission basically to kick Russia out of much territory as possible. Maybe the enemy, okay, here us in these open source, we might not have clear understanding or an exact nature of Russia's military, but is the area where they're going to launch a counteroffensive, are they at a stronger strength? Are they better equipped? Maybe these are units that are better trained, more of the kind of the traditional VDV, et cetera, that generally perform better. Or are these just recent recruits that have no idea what they're doing, right? And I think that's where the Ukrainian, when they're analyzing the enemy, they might make a determination based on that as well. Hey, do we need to do more deep strike, more strikes in the front line, weaken them so they do the offensive? If you look at troops and equipment, I think, to your point, I think that's a lot the Ukrainians have already received. I think these guys have been doing an extensive amount of training for months, and the equipment, it looks like a significant portion of the equipment necessary for this counteroffensive is there. So I think in that aspect, okay, we're good. And then so the other two, kind of terrain and weather, that depends on the situation on the ground. Are we expecting rain? And, obviously that is a problem for mud season in Ukraine. We've all seen that. So maybe the Ukrainians like, we're expecting rain next week. Maybe we need to hold off because we don't want to be bogged down by mud, and we wanted that speed and our ability to push and continue to push as hard as possible, not to be interrupted because of weather. And that can delay an offensive operations for legitimate reasons. And it says nothing with the Ukrainians' military capability. It's just a fact of the ground, right? And then there's also civil considerations, right? Like, where this offensive are going? Like, how many Ukrainian citizens and civilians are still there? Because from the Ukrainian government standpoint, these are still Ukrainians that are under illegal occupation, and we need to take care of them and make sure they're good, right? And so when you analyze these types of military operations from those metrics, right, it makes it very fluid when a decision to launch happens. And I think a good historical example is D-Day, right, when everybody was waiting on that weather report. I mean, we've all studied history, all knew it. And based on the weathers, when they were going to launch an offensive, and it was either going to be January 5th, 6th, or I think later, a couple of weeks later, I think it was like June 5th, June 6th, and then June, 20th, I believe it was, right, for D-Day. So I think a lot of these variables are very well known by the Ukrainian military. I think from at least a troop and equipment standpoint, it feels like they're very confident that they have it. So now they just have to look at everything else and find the right moment to strike. But I think the important conversation that we should be having is, do they have the capabilities to do this? Are the Ukrainians trained to do this? And I think we can all probably assume that they are at that level. So everything else, well, it just depends on all these unknowns, and some of them outside of the control of the Ukrainian military, to make that final decision when to launch offensive operations.
Yeah, and I think anyone who says they empirically know the date, either and honestly at this point, as you said, I don't even think the Ukrainians have a hard set date right now. Just because it depends on so many factors that they want to have the assets in position to actually go forward and make the offensive. They don't necessarily have a hard set date to do that because, again, they're watching weather conditions, they're watching, Russian emplacements, they're watching Russian strategy, they're watching what the Russians are doing as a whole. So I do think that is still a fluid date in the near future.
I think it's going to happen. I think we could all fairly assume, and it's almost a certainty, it's going to happen. But to Technical's point, yeah, so many variables. So the exact date, it'll probably happen. And probably, maybe even the Ukrainians only know they're going to make a decision. They have 24 hours to start, right? I mean, that's the difficulty when you're running in these types of situations. But I think the key point is, it's going to happen. They have a substantial amount of forces available for this, and that is very worrisome. If you're a Russian, military officer, soldier, or general, I would be panicking right now because of that.
Yeah, I mean, I know what the male bloggers are doing. They're definitely not having a fun time right now. Though granted, the attention that they're getting is also probably something they like anyway. So 50-50 on that one.
Yeah, I think you two summed it up better than I. The only thing I would say is it's near term. It's going to happen near term, but beyond that, looking at specifics, as I think you guys kind of laid out, there really isn't any major indicators to narrow that down to a specific date or even like a specific week, I would say. So, yeah, the indicators are there that it's going to happen. It's just a question of when.
Yeah. I find it funny. Someone is recommending on Twitter right now a UN NATO backed intervention to hold the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Man, Twitter is great sometimes. That's the counteroffensive we all want to see, right?
It's been a while since we had a large scale UN intervention. We're due.
Oh yeah. Just drop paratroopers on the Russians. It's a great idea.
Just blue helmets from whichever contributing country wants to do that.
And I think on that note, we should probably switch over. What else did we want to hit on today?
I think there was mention, wasn't there, of sort of the situation in Israel, which kind of unfolded not long after we recorded.
Oh, good Lord. I'm sorry. My brain is fried to a point where something happened more than 2 weeks ago. I don't even remember it.
The problem with Twitter is where, like, I feel like something that pops and you tweet and it happened a couple hours ago, that's old news, and you just completely forget.
Yeah, I know there was a series of rocket attacks, I think 3 weeks ago now. Let me check to when the bulk of them were. No,
So I
a
think
bit
it
over 2
all,
weeks ago. Yeah, a bit over 2
yeah,
weeks ago now.
yeah, it all started because Israel launched that targeted assassination campaign against senior commanders, Palestinian Islamic Jihad commanders in Gaza. The Israelis were claiming, they were planning imminent terrorist attacks in Israel. So the Israelis then launched assassination campaigns, targeted attacks against these senior commanders, and actually most of the Israeli Gaza conflict that we saw this last iteration is the Israelis did target a lot of, probably more than usual, senior Palestinian Islamic Jihad commanders a lot more, and had a lot of success. I think this was mostly, unless anybody here has any different information, but from mostly what I've tracked is that this was Israeli against the PIG, and then kind of Hamas, kind of did not get actively involved in this round, and that probably allowed this round of conflict to end sooner than it would have, because I think if Hamas would have gotten more involved, this conflict would probably have lasted a lot longer and have been a lot more intense than what we've seen right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the big things that we saw was a few more rockets getting through the Iron Dome. But that was probably due to massed attacks more than anything. I think that, nothing. These systems obviously are highly complex at minimum. And again, I mean, if you shoot hundreds and hundreds of rockets against a system like that, some are going to get through. And so we did see some various impacts across, I think, southern and south central Israel proper, from the rocket attacks.
And it always strikes me with these situations that the Palestinian Islamic Jihad and their similar groups fire so many of these rockets. And as you say, some of them obviously do get through, and the Israelis have made it very clear that they don't launch interceptors against the rockets they know are going to land in open fields and so on. But it strikes me that we haven't so far seen Israel sort of run out of interceptors, or at the very least, if they've come close to it, there's been no sort of indication of that. I think, comparing with sort of the situation with air defences over Kiev recently, we've seen a lot of people pointing out, there's hundreds of these sort of air defence rockets being launched, and I'm intrigued to know sort of what Israel's production capacity is for the Iron Dome, and whether or not they have come close to sort of running out of interceptors during sort of these skirmishes that we've seen over the last couple of years, and particularly this one the other week. Whereas you say that, I think the eventual figure was something like over 1,000 rockets were fired at Israel during that incident, and that's, if you think about that in terms of just surface-to-air missiles and so on, traditionally, that is a huge amount of sort of targets to try and engage. Obviously, Iron Dome has the benefit of being not sort of a traditional surface-to-air missile as such, and as a result, there are more of them, and they can be produced more easily, I would imagine. But I'd be intrigued to know sort of where the situation lies in terms of how much capacity Israel's really got for dealing with these sort of barrages that last for days on end.
Yeah, I mean, there are capabilities on both sides of the thing, on both sides of the situation.
Personally, I wouldn't lose too much sleep about Israeli stockpiles for interceptors. I think, like, when we're comparing, obviously the numbers are high in regards to usage, but when we look at sort of the defense industrial base of Israel in comparison to a country like Ukraine, Israel, itself hasn't really seen targeting of its sort of like domestic military industrial complex. It's still extremely well funded. It has been for the last few decades, and to my understanding at least, since the second really Intifada, we haven't seen large scale sort of use of equipment by Israeli land forces that would sort of test that production base. Most of the attacks coming from Gaza have been rocket based, and so that's there's obviously been a priority placed upon Iron Dome and placed upon having sufficient stockpiles of interceptors. Is it going to cost the Israelis a pretty penny to keep it up? Yeah, but they have quite a few pretty pennies left in the purse, so I'm not terribly worried about them running out anytime soon.
Any other topics we want to hit on? John, did you have anything in mind specifically?
Well, I think we did also just mention at the start we were going to discuss.
Yeah, I can kind of provide a brief summary with that. Luckily I got Austin here, who's also somebody I coordinate a lot with when we're talking about Mexico, Central America, and Latin America. So the key aspect that we saw, obviously, was the end of what was called Title 42. So Title 42, just a quick summary, was a policy input during the Trump administration during COVID, and it's a health policy, code that allows the United States to expel and deny entry to anybody crossing into the United States. And so the Trump administration utilized Title 42 to basically, any migrants that cross the border, they could just grab them quickly and then deport them quickly, right? There was the thing about Title 42 is it did not provide an avenue for the administration or any administration to do legal procedures against anybody crossing the border, right? Because it was a health code policy, they could be deported as many times as necessary, as many times as they want. The U.S. government wanted, but there was no legal tool enforcement measure to hold people because of crossing the border, let's say illegally or et cetera like that, to be held accountable in a kind of the rule of law in the court. So the Biden administration, because kind of COVID obviously is done, wanted to get away from Title 42 and go back to what was Title 8, the historical nature of U.S. immigration enforcement. Now, Title 8 has been in the laws for over 50 years. It is, you talk to any immigration specialist and lawyers, and they would all admit that Title 8 is a very old, outdated code that needs to be updated. And so the Biden administration reverted back to Title 8, which does allow for criminal penalties against people who might cross the border illegally. It is the tool that the government can utilize if they decide to use so. The concern was with Title 42 being revoked that there was going to be kind of this rush into the United States. There was other policies in place during the Trump and the Biden administration that try to mitigate the amount of migrants crossing into the United States. But for the most part, we just didn't see a huge rush across the border. There were some areas of concerns, Brownsville specifically, bordering Matamoros and sometimes, in El Paso and some other border communities. But honestly, this wasn't something that was outside of what these communities and these border communities have dealt with in the past, especially since 2014 and to today. There was not that. There was not this mass rush. Although there was a spike at the beginning, originally were people trying to cross the border, that quickly went down and is on more at historically normal levels that the federal government can easily utilize. So that's kind of the migration aspect of the U.S. Mexico border. A lot of people are obviously monitoring that. But again, I think the summary is that the scare, especially if you talk to like Republican operatives and GOP politicians, was our borders are being invaded. Look at all these migrants. That's blatantly false. And to refer to any migrants as invasion, I think is a disservice and totally inflammatory terms to refer to that. But that just didn't happen. We didn't see this match dash that a lot of us or a lot of them were fearing. And then outside of that, I think what happened specifically, if you look at Mexico and along the U.S. and Mexico border, a specific region that's seen a huge level of increase in violence, already higher than we've seen in the past. It's a border state called Tamaulipas. That Mexican state borders the southeast portion of Texas. And what we saw in Tamaulipas is basically a continuation and an intensification of a civil war within the Gulf Cartel. So the two main groups that are operating, that are part of the Gulf Cartel, is the one based out of Matamoros, which borders Brownsville, Texas, they call themselves the Scorpion Group, Grupo Scorpiones. And then in Reynosa, Texas, that borders Reynosa, Tamaulipas, which borders McAllen, Texas. In Reynosa, you have the Metros, the Group Cartel Metros faction. The Metro factions are aligned with CJNG, one of the largest cartels and one of the most powerful cartels in Mexico. And it looks like a lot of this violence that we're seeing in Tamaulipas is because CGNG, specifically with their groups that operate there, Metros and Old School Zetas, that's the other group, try to make a push, at least for more control in Tamaulipas. The Scorpion Group out of Matamoros said basically, absolutely not. We are going to stop you and we're going to fight you. And so that's kind of what we saw, specifically in the first 2 weeks of May and the last week of April. We saw an intense level of violence between the Scorpion groups against the Old School Zetas, which are aligned with Metros and CGNG, and then also the Metros. So Tamaulipas specifically, that is kind of like where a lot of the violence has happened. And then lately also just a lot of reporting is starting to come out about Los Chapitos, which is our Chapo's son who run the Sinaloa cartel, and a lot of the business and trade and fentanyl drug distribution that they have in the United States. I mean, Los Chapitos are a major drug trafficker into the United States and around the world, specifically against fentanyl. So there's been amazing reporting about that specific group and El Chapo's son's involvement in the fentanyl drug trade.
I was waiting for Tamaulipas time, and now that it's Tamaulipas time, I would, number one, agree with just about everything All Source just said there. First and foremost, in regards to some of the stuff we saw going into the information space about Title 42 and about how there's going to be sort of a massive surge of people over the U.S. southern border. Numbers-wise, that did not come to pass. It seemed to be more normal as usual, and I think that's to be expected because to be quite honest, when you look at a lot of the reasons that people are trying to get into the United States, whether they're seeking to immigrate or they're seeking asylum, generally speaking, they're not really caring about U.S. health policy in the process. That's not generally something that goes into the calculus. So it makes a ton of sense that we didn't see sort of this massive surge there. Secondarily, there's been a lot of posts online. There's been some news commentators talking about the threat of people on the terror watch list being caught on the U.S. southern border. There has not been a major increase in that either. And I think it's also kind of worth reminding all of our listeners that there has not been, to my knowledge at least, there has not been sort of a single terrorist attack executed in the United States as a result of the southern border, of operatives coming over from there. So I think that remains sort of an issue that federal agencies need to keep an eye on. But as of right now, it has not come to fruition at all. And secondarily, in regards to what's happening in across the border in Tamaulipas itself, is sort of a tale as old as time when we talk about wars between the cartels and how quickly sort of violence in Mexican states can escalate when two cartels are competing for territory. Because there are parts of Mexico that are completely dominated on a local governance scale, on a local economic scale by a single cartel that are relatively far more peaceful than areas where two cartels are fighting. When there's border friction between cartels, and whether that's between major elements of major cartels or from smaller factions like in Tamaulipas, Los Metros and Grupo de Escorpiones, that's where you start to see violence escalate quite rapidly. And we've seen that happen in Reynosa. We've seen that happen in Matamoros. And from my standpoint, from what I've seen, and All Source, feel free to chime in here, I don't see any indication of that ending anytime soon. It still seems like it's quite an ongoing, it's an ongoing turf war, and it's an ongoing conflict.
Yeah, it's still ongoing. One of those centers where we've seen a lot of conflict is kind of in the southern tip of Tamaulipas. It's called San Fernando. That's kind of like the huge border, kind of the borderlines between these groups of factions, and they're fighting for that specific town. Los Grupos Scorpiones and then Old School Zetas. Mainly, that's where they've been fighting. And yeah, it's to Austin's point. I mean, literally, it's when multiple cartels operate in a specific region where we see high levels of violence. I mean, Guanajuato, a Mexican state, is a perfect example where you have a large cartel, the CJNG, fighting a more, a smaller one, the Santa Rosa de Lima cartel. but very high levels of violence and propensity to just kill anybody who might oppose you is generally how these groups operate. I mean, Santa Rosa de Lima cartel has done a lot of mass shootings against public venues, bars, and we see 10, 8, 12 people killed in these attacks, specifically because these businesses and bars might be a front or used for money laundering for the CGNG. And so, one important aspect that Austin touched upon that I'd like to expand is that, I think it was like sometime late last year, I believe it was October, the Washington Post had an amazing article, and they mentioned that, or it might have been the New York Times actually, but they mentioned that 30 to 35%, based on U.S. military estimates, 30 to 35% of Mexican territory is completely ungoverned and controlled absolutely by the cartels, right? And again, when we're talking about the cartels, there are dozens of groups. The two big ones, obviously, are the Sinaloa cartel and CGNG, but all these groups have their own factions inside and operate internally. The Sinaloa cartel is divided into two main ones: Los Chapitos, which is El Chapo's son, and then Mayo Zambada, which was El Chapo's right-hand man. Those are the two groups that both of them have fought. Now there's basically this uneven truce, calm, and they all trying to get along. But I think that's an important aspect when we're talking about it. Like, that cartel presence in Mexico, I think is more than what people realize. And it is concerning. And then the Mexican government, the Mexican president specifically, when he came into office, really ran on this platform of demilitarizing the drug war, right, or the cartel war. I mean, he tried to remove the military from this fight. And we've seen how he completely pivoted. And if anything, he's probably the most militaristic president that Mexico has, specifically since their transition to a multi-party democracy. I mean, the military is heavily involved under the current Mexican president's administration, not only in the fight against the cartels, but in a lot of sectors that are just normal government control that are not affected necessarily by corruption. And he uses the Mexican military just for his own pet projects, for his own political power, or for nationalistic purposes and political purposes. And I think that's also extremely concerning.
I would absolutely agree, and I would also say that so some of those assessments regarding like how much territory does the Mexican government actually control or have like a monopoly on violence over vary. I remember there was I believe it was a Homeland Security report about a year ago, maybe 6 months ago, that said 45% of the country wasn't sort of directly governed or able to be without significant sort of military involvement. But I think it's also important mentioning that the cartels aren't just, a physical presence. They aren't just a militarized force, even though they basically are. They're an economic force. And in many of the areas that they govern, they are able to take money out of the local economy, but also put money in through either illicit or completely, normally legal industries, such as agriculture, such as heavy industry. And as a result of that, the Mexican government has really struggled, not just with, the sicarios themselves, but also with, local populaces that are angry when they intervene. Because whenever the Mexican military rolls into a town, they're interrupting economic activity and they're interrupting a lot of, the civilian populace's day to day. And if that civilian populace relies upon sort of financial input from the cartels, then it's very hard to, conduct hearts and minds when people aren't making the same amount of money that they used to.
Yeah, I mean, the last point I'd say on this for everybody here is
oh yeah, you think that's the last point you're going to get out?
Oh, sorry, well, really
I
sorry.
have a
Go
comment.
ahead. No. I didn't know this was an open. I didn't know if people were interested by all means, but I did want to highlight in May. I believe it's May 12th. It's Mother's Day in Mexico. And as every year, to tie to Austin was saying about kind of the soft power, every year in May 12th, we see cartels, hand out presents to mothers. So that happened again this year. There's multiple videos, but specifically CGNG. You saw videos of them in one Mexican state, Michoacan, also in Jalisco, another state. Jalisco has been basically the birthplace of the CGNG. Just videos of them handing out presents to mothers and to the communities and saying, hey, from our leader, Mencho, from CGNG, we wish all mothers a happy Mother's Day. Here's the presents. And then you just see the mothers all there saying, thank you so much, Senor Mencho. We appreciate this. And that just kind of highlights the soft power that the Mexican cartels also have within these local communities.
Yeah, so what I was going to say is, speaking about winning hearts and minds, and I don't think we touched on this earlier, but there has been a push, very, very consistently and broadly, from one side of the aisle in the U.S. Towards some sort of kinetic intervention against cartel activity in Mexico. And I think I just posed this as an open question of how badly would that go? The various pitfalls that would exist there just off the top of my head. But I mean, nail it down, political, other ramifications. But a bushfire war on our border, how would that end up?
Yeah, and so it's funny you bring that up, Technical, because I am part of a kind of these political spaces where we do have specifically Republican leadership and congressmen and women join. And that's something I really want to now hound in and specifically question it, because right now, in January of 2023, Congressman Crenshaw proposed to utilize the AUMF against Mexican cartels, right? And you're right. I mean, this is 100% from GOP conservative side of the House of utilizing military force against the Mexican cartels, and how much that is genuine and how much is just political posturing because of the issue of the border in general, and this idea that the border is under siege and we need to do something, and the military is a tool to fight it. So what my philosophy is, and my policy would be of this is that from a U.S. side, and I think when this was asked to the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, General Milley, he basically said, "Okay, we're not going to do anything in Mexico without Mexicans, right? I mean, and this is a Mexican-led fight." And I think that's kind of the philosophy across the administration is we always try to do as much as we can, but always within the permissions of the Mexican government, because they're a sovereign country and this is their territory. And more importantly, we have a lot more interest regarding Mexico than just cartels. I mean, our economic relations with Mexico, they're one of our largest trading partners.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. No, largest actually now.
Yeah. So and with NAFTA 2.0, NAFTA, et cetera. I mean, and our decoupling with China. I mean, Mexico is just going to get more and more and more important. I mean, many businesses are shutting shop in China and moving to Mexico, right? I mean, that's going to be the conversation in international trade within the next decade as Mexico industrial powerhouse related to the United States, and how if Mexico was important now, just wait 10 years from now, how much more important it's going to be, right? And I think that's why we know we need to, when we talk about Mexico, we can't just be so heartily consumed by the conversation of the cartels. So I think that's kind of the philosophy that I had. Don't do anything without the Mexicans. And look, most U.S. administrations, bipartisan, will always criticize the Mexican government that they can always do more. There's always more that they can do. But at the same token, you also have to analyze this from the Mexican government standpoint, right? You have to acknowledge that there is also, they have concerns about not wanting open warfare in Mexican cities, right? Even though there's very high levels of violence now, it can always get worse. I am not necessarily, I said this early in right here in this conversation with you guys, and I'll say it again, right? Like, Mexican governments tend to utilize the military to fight the cartels because it's really the only tool they have left to fight them. And more importantly, and I was talking to a very legitimate reporter actually yesterday about this, is that the Mexican cartels are becoming militarized, right? We see the tactics they utilize are becoming more and more of a militarized force, right? We see them utilize kind of like, we see this in Iraq and Syria, these Mad Max vehicles that ISIS have utilized, these kind of crewed up, armored, locally made vehicles. We see that regularly in Mexico all the time. The utilization of drones to do strikes and reconnaissance, that is also very now common. The weapons cartels have, right? And I think when we're having a conversation of cartels, we kind of imagine this like 80s, 90s narco Mexico and compare them kind of like to this American mafia, right, in the 20s and 30s, where they're just a bunch of gangsters and mobsters, and that's how they operate, and they're all in it for the drugs. But we completely ignore the militarization that the cartels have done in the last 10 to 20 years. And more importantly,
I think the best way to put it is kind of Taliban with more organization.
Yeah, I think that is a very fair assessment, right? And the cartels are becoming more and more militarized, right? Now, the benefit, I would say, at least why the Americans, we don't have where we don't need to utilize U.S. military resources for this, is that for the cartels' point of view is the Mexican military still is the greatest threat that the cartels have, right? The last thing they want is the Mexican military down their throat because they know that they can't win that fight. But there's always that concern of the Mexican military being able to outgun the government. And I think we should not, as a U.S., inflame and pour gasoline in the fire. And I think a unilateral strike or military operations will do minimal to really affect a lot of the cartel's calculus, but can just inflame tensions to make the situation significantly worse without Mexican government approval.
I think the comparison of the Taliban, but worse, holds a bit of water. But I would add on to it, and I would say, no, obviously the cartels are not this like ideological force that the Taliban were. They're, it's far more of an economic factor. But I think if you want to make the Taliban comparison, you would also say that in some bizarro world where the United States decides, it's Pancho Villa Expedition Part 2, we'd be looking at far more resistance from across the board, the civilian populace, far more coordination with, cartel assets from them, far less of, because at least when it came to fighting the Taliban, there was a significant portion of the Afghan population that on an ideological basis disagreed with the Taliban and were willing to help U.S. forces or coalition forces, carry out missions. In the case of like a direct physical U.S. intervention, we'd be looking at large swaths of Mexico that are just like, what are you doing here? Like, why are you invading my land? And so I think the conversation about making this a kinetic war from the U.S. against the cartels holds. It's number one, it's the wrong tool for the wrong job. It's like trying to take a sledgehammer to a screw. It doesn't impact the major economic drivers that drive cartel recruitment. It doesn't take into account what sort of allows cartels to sustain themselves through like legitimate industry, because cartels are so intertwined with legitimate industry at this point. It's not. I know I've some, particularly on the Republican side, you hear talks of drone striking drug labs and things like that. But if there was an actual kinetic campaign to cut off the cartel's funding, that would mean bombing cornfields, bombing wheat fields, right? Because burning down avocado orchards. And at the end of the day, if you scorch earth, an area that you're trying to win hearts and minds, that's oil and water.
Yeah,
yeah.
No, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say, when we're talking about cartels, it's not just drugs. I mean, it's more. I mean, we know cartels just trade on avocados, lime, timber, water, oil, extortion of businesses, legitimate businesses. It's so widespread that it's not just drugs.
Yeah, it is the entire economic system, to a degree.
And the last point I'll make is that the threat of further U.S. sort of involvement thus far has mostly, kept cartel violence that's not directly targeted between cartel operatives south of the U.S. border. The moment, it goes kinetic, there no longer is sort of that deterrence or that reason for cartels not to target, border towns, not to target American civilians in an attempt to sort of wane American morale. So, if the U.S. trundles over the southern border, those bets are off, and I would reasonably expect there to be, reprisal attacks on American civilians.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of there's a lot that would happen. There is an immense amount of complexity to that situation as a whole, and it would not be a simple, one and done, in and out, solve the issue, and there it goes. And also the other potential ramifications of that could also include greater civilian migration as well, where you would have people very rightly fleeing a conflict that would have been even more turbocharged. It would be a destabilizing event.
That's an excellent point. I mean, you think we have a migration crisis now, just cause a war on our southern border, and then let's have that conversation after the fact. Like you're just going to put that in overdrive. And a lot of these border communities in the United States, I live in a border community in the U.S., which borders Mexico. I mean, it's so intertwined. I mean, these are sister cities that, and families are on both sides of the border and freely travel back and forth. And it's wholeheartedly dependent on that free trade between the borders and ability to do that and just cross. And if you shut that down with the war, you're going to have a lot of U.S. border communities, and the U.S. economy as a whole suffer significantly. And I just don't think it's in our interest.
Number one trading partner. I mean, that's pretty starting not a war with, but a war in our number one trading partner would be a bad idea, I think. I think that was it. If you want to lead us out, John, I'll let you.
No worries. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for listening. That's it for this week, and we shall be back next month. We already have a guest lined up for next month's episode. I won't give away any spoilers yet, but it should be a good discussion. And All Source, once again, thank you very much, mate, for joining us. It's been a pleasure having you.
Hey, thank you so much again for you guys having me, especially 2 straight months in a row. And I would consider a success that, we had managed to have a great discussion and everything, but more importantly, to cover the right topic, to cover a lot is cartels. And it was great that it's get here because I think it's an important issue that should be highlighted, and the complexity of it, and having a conversation with great minds here is really, really awesome. And I really appreciate the time to share that with you guys.
And so with that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for listening. This has been the Osint Bunker podcast, and we will catch you next time.